What happened?
All right, let's get started. Sure. There are donuts here. I don't want to take any home.
They won't go home with you if they're
They're
just
from
going John.
Golden Donuts on
Okay.
Tudor, which is
A good
Google.
midtown
You can go
business,
in
thank
there,
you.
order, and get your donuts in about 5 minutes, but getting through the intersection is 15.
Used to be a bank until my bank.
You know, some planning person can figure that out.
I'll
On that
try.
note, I'm leaving, thanks.
So we are going to start today. Oh, we should go around and say hello to everybody. Sorry. John Weddleton.
Dick Brady.
Forrest Dunbar.
Pete Peterson. Chris Schutte, Director of Office of Economic Community Development.
Kathy Gleason, Tournament Community Council.
Francis McLaughlin, Planning Department.
Patrick Flynn, voluntary volunteer on the committee.
Stephanie Mormel, traffic engineer. Amanda Moses, clerk's office.
Mandy Office, Clerk's Office. Dan Alstein.
Mike Dillard.
Steve Hope, trying to open another business in the way.
Hugh Wade, Papalina, Alaska.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. We are going to. Agenda look good. We are going to start with the continuation of this shortest or most practical pedestrian route discussion. And at our last meeting, we sent it to Patrick and Amy and Stephanie and Erica to look at where we were and write something up. Erica came out with a version that went to Stephanie. Stephanie, you had a few changes, and I think that's what we have printed here. It's the ones kind of accepting your changes. And then Jana looked at that and made some changes. So who wants to talk about it?
I'll start. Then Stephanie, add your thoughts. And I'm sure you have some more. And just to be clear, the discussion that was planned to be with me and Amy, myself and Amy and Stephanie and Erica, introducing myself, Stephanie and Erica, came with me to join us. So I backread her later. So she's aware of this, and seen it, said thank you. Don't know if she's in accordance with it. So I'll speak for somebody else. What Erica initially brought to us was what I had suggested, what we had sort of suggested at the table last week or 2 weeks ago, which was using major arterials as holding major arterials above to a different standard. In other words, not allowing pedestrian crossings for measurement purposes willy-nilly, but focusing in fact on legal marked crossings. Erica had some discomfort with that, and so, and specifically because we have a differential standard between protected uses at the state level versus the local level. In other words, there are more exceptions in the local regulatory framework than there are in the state regulatory framework. So in order to address that, we try to divorce the two. And what you see on page 2, lines 6 through 10, Erica specifically calls out the protected uses that we added at the local regulatory level. And the thinking there is that the state is kind of depending on us to do their evaluations for them. And if we're not doing it in accordance with their standard, the 500 feet from their protected uses, then they might get a little bit difficult. They can't have faith in what we're doing at our level. I will call out one exception. We decided to leave in our measurement religious assemblies, which is also a state protected use. And the reasoning there was, first off, anyone who's crazy enough to try and put a facility like this, across the street from a mainline congregation, Grace Christian, LDS, Holy Family, ABT, deserves to have their application shot down. That's nuts. However, we have some smaller congregations in Anchorage, and this is something the planning folks brought up, that secure industrial space, and they meet once, twice, maybe 3 times a week. And for good or for ill, Title 21 does not prohibit non-industrial uses in industrial space. And the thinking was, in those instances where you have periodic low-level utilization, it would be burdensome on industry to eliminate everything in that area just because you have periodic use by a smaller congregation that didn't necessarily have a vested interest in the, call it, neighborhood integrity. So that was the one exception that we, from the state protected uses that we included in our exception to the major arterials and larger routes. I could have just ignored that, but I thought it was worth making note so that we're conscious of understanding. And if a congregation did have an objection brought it forward, then it would probably not clear the bar on the state level. But to the extent the state is delegating to us, we can make our judgment and work it out. And if it's been busting, I apologize, I was just trying to.
No, you're fine. There was an unfortunate moose car incident on the Glen Highway.
No, you will help.
Oh, no.
All right, just for the record, Ms. Zabowski joined us.
So, Ross, I just sort of recapped what myself, Erica, and Stephanie came up with that review on Friday.
Yep.
So with that, I'll turn it over to Stephanie and her thoughts. If she has, or wants to express them.
Yes, yeah. My hesitancy with this, and I brought this up to Patrick, and I've had a brief discussion with Scott Thomas, that is the Central Region DOT and PF, Department of Transportation and Public Facilities traffic engineer, is that I don't want to create ambiguity in the sense of what code says is legal pedestrian crossing locations and then what we are measuring distance. I don't want to say I don't care, but how these distances are measured really have no impact, I guess no real impact on me and how I do business and how I'm looking at safety and how I'm discussing and looking at code. And I like the idea of keeping the two separate. So when I'm reading this, I understand what we're trying to do. We're trying to put something in that people will, one, hopefully can understand, two, will be able to measure and get an idea of whether or not a location is allowable for our standards, and have something that is predictable and repeatable so that not everybody's coming up with a different answer. I know in talking with Scott Thomas and myself, like, we're hesitant to put something that could be in conflict with what state statute and code are as far as what's legal for pedestrians to cross.
And if I may, so we did have this conversation, and my suggested resolution, which others may find wise and some not, was this is an AM where we're providing direction to planning staff. At this point, I see no particular need to codify it. And so we can see how it works, see what potential conflicts it engenders with DOT. If there's a problem, we can come back and address it. We haven't put anything in concrete, so to speak, that can't be reconsidered. So that, and, so that was my fig leaf to Stephanie, because I understand, having dealt with transportation bureaucracies now for about 20 years.
Yeah.
They don't move fast. And they want to be thoughtful, and for good reasons.
And this has brought up, I will tell you, it has brought up and continues to bring up discussions between us and the state as far as the language about, specifically one that we all have issues with is business districts. And the the definition of business district, pretty much any corridor that has businesses that align it could be considered a business district. And technically by code, when you read it, it can prohibit bicycles from being on either sidewalks or the off-street facilities, which is not really the intent in a lot of areas of town where we don't have continuous on-street facilities for bicycles, and that's the only place for them to be, especially when they're adjacent to 45-mile-per-hour traffic. So one of the discussions that we have between Scott and I that we're trying to do is, propose, we know the central business district has been defined. It is adopted, it kind of has, and trying to find language to either say, like, we have the central business district and other business districts that have been defined per ordinance, so that if we do want to define certain business districts and take, if there's certain areas of Spenard, if there's certain areas, if there's other areas where we want to have specific business districts that have their own rules as it relates to pedestrians and bicyclists, there are ways to do that, because the central business district really is the one that's special within the municipality of Anchorage.
Naturally.
Yes. Yeah. But not wanting to prohibit the use of sidewalks, for different users in other areas of town, unconsciously, and that is kind of what's happening when we don't have a continuous system. So that conversation is kind of happening separately due to a lot of the non-motorized coordination, the continues and the bike plan and the pedestrian plan and all those conversations. Ended up getting brought up again when I shared this language to Scott Thomas, and as we're looking at it. I agree with Patrick, if it's being used just as a memorandum, I guess, for guidance for staff, and so that people have a better expectation, and we're trying to define it so that they understand it. I'm a lot more comfortable with that than trying to codify it. If we were going to codify it, I would definitely want it to go through DOT, specifically because about 70% of the major arterials are DOT owned.
Okay. And just saying, Scott Thomas is DOT.
Yes. Yes.
George?
Yeah, so Pat, you had, we said you want to keep us out of conflict with the state. That's why you're, treating our additional categories different from their categories. But has the state defined, and what we're really talking about is what a shortest practicable pedestrian route is. Have they done anything to define what a pedestrian route is or shortest practical is?
They have not, and in general, according to Eric, I have to be very careful not speaking for her, so she's out of town, and so, Francis stuck me for all over, so if you think I'm looking ahead of her, please let me know. But what Erica explained to me is they're basically counting on us to define that at our level. And the 500-foot separations, and they will generally, was what she impressed upon me, concur with us if we decide that this is a 500-foot separation. And that's why I acceded to her concern about let's try to be differential between what their standards are and what our standards are. If we're gonna do something a little bit different than what we would define, let's break it out and focus on the things that we have defined as protected uses.
Okay, I'll get you. I'm going to go around here. Pete?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it was strange, I think, that I just happened to be at a community council meeting last night, and the fourth item on their agenda was dealing with pedestrians crossing major thoroughfares, and they were sending a letter to Mr. Thomas asking him if he could put up no jaywalking signs.
I have
and
This is University of Cuba Council, that explains all.
I have I picked up the other 4 copies so you can see what we're talking about.
I mean, there was a lady there that was talking about traumatic head injuries for people who had been hit crossing non-crosswalks. And so, I don't think the assembly wants to be seen encouraging people to cross major thoroughfares at non-designated crosswalks. I just don't think it's a good policy for us to make.
So if I could add to that just briefly, because I was there. So it was brought to us by a speech pathologist who works with traumatic brain injury. And a couple of her patients, she said, were struck trying to cross at Wright and Tudor. And that's what this refers to. And so they're begging DOT to put up no jaywalking signs and try to cut down the number of people that scamper across Tudor. And we've had a fatality in a similar situation on Muldoon. You know, it might just be the nature of our district, but we are a district that's crisscrossed by major arterials. And we've been trying to do what we can to prevent people from crossing at non-marked crosswalks. So my disagreement with this AIM as currently written, I guess, is a little bit different perhaps than yours, Pat, or at least as I understand it. But I think for any of the uses, I think we should stick to marked crosswalks with regards to major arterials. Now, if you want to talk about small residential roads or whatever, different conversation. But we are trying to do what we can to prevent people from running across Muldoon and Tudor.
I wouldn't object to being more aggressive about this. I was trying to be respectful of Eric and Stephanie's concerns in raising for. So.
Okay, let's jump on Amy.
Thank you. So a couple of things. Number one, because this is an AM, it is directional and doesn't have the effect of law. I mean, we could say we want to pay money at every single, assembly staff meeting, but it does not have the effect of law. This is just literally guidance. So one thing that I think might help, and maybe it'd make it more confusing, I don't know. But Stephanie, would it give you more comfort at the end of line 13 if we just added on to say this AM is not intended to supersede state law or muni code? I mean, it might make it more, would it help just to say, if you get in a position where you're like, you know what, sorry, it's not gonna work here, it still gives you kind of that fallback, or does that make it more confusing?
I don't think it would hurt to have it.
Because it's just an amplification of the fact that the law is still the law. This is generally a guidance for most scenarios, but as the traffic engineer and as the department director, as you guys look at specific scenarios, you might just say no. And I think that would kind of bolster the fallback. I don't, you can think about it, you can ponder it.
Yeah.
But whether it helps or hurts, I'm not sure. And I had another question and I forgot it already. I'll come back. Sorry.
Dick?
Patrick, you started the discussion about smaller congregations. Did you define what smaller means?
We did not define it, and this is the sort of thing when you get to the case-by-case scenario. But the general scenario we're describing is a congregation leases space in an industrial district that is less expensive.
I know where they're at, they're all over town.
Right, and they do Bible study Tuesday.
General reading, whatever.
Something on Thursday and then service on Sunday.
I wasn't making that face at you. I was making that face at him.
I got you. But, you know,
That was for you, Amy.
Oh, I don't do tarot cards, thank you though.
So it's just trying not to,
Maybe laugh.
and, we can argue all day long whether it was a good idea to allow non-industrial uses on industrial lands in the new Title 21. And I don't want to get into that discussion because I hate Title 21. But
10 years plus.
But, so that was sort of the, let's not overly burden already scarce industrial lands. That was the nature of it.
Thank you.
Okay, Amy, question 2.
I remembered my second question. It was to do with, have we even discussed Janice suggested edits on this yet?
No.
Okay, I'll hold mine.
I want to just chime in. My trying to understand this stuff is the Pete thing is really what we're trying to do, is my understanding, and I printed out a list of protected uses and put it there to help people, but it's not. It's to vaguely come up with a way of keeping the sphere of influence of these protected uses away from the sphere of influence of marijuana facilities. So how do we do that? What you do is a crow flies. There's a number of ways. So the kind of the proxy for keeping these spheres of influence separate is walking routes. So really, that's all it is. So it's not anything in there that would encourage people to cross the street. And in fact, when you have these separate, the protected uses idea is we want them separate. So if I'm a churchgoer, I don't go to that. So it's not like, because I'm a church, now I want to go there. We put them close. close. So it's really, the idea is that in general, these protected uses, you wouldn't wanna go there anyway, you wouldn't wanna look at it, and that's the idea. So, and that's kind of the problem I have with the whole walking route thing, is does it keep those spheres of influence separate? We're finding that it doesn't, because you can have a marijuana facility right across the street from a church if it's an arterial and you use a crosswalk. So I've kind of, in my head, separated from this. We're not encouraging people to cross Tudor because there's a marijuana shop here and a church here. We're just trying to keep those spheres of influence separate. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So anyway, that's kind of my view on that real quick. But let's go, Hugh has some.
I had some questions just to understand what the mechanics is and some comments. The question, just so I get this straight, Patrick, is on that 6 through 10. So is what I understood you saying was the state has certain protected uses, but we have more protected uses. And so 6 through 10 was an effort to call out our in excess protected uses plus religious assemblies?
Correct.
Okay. So, I guess my comment is this, which is, I've maintained all along that practical pedestrian route is basically, it doesn't really matter how it affects or encourages people to walk across the street or what's legal. It's a very specific term that's used in relation to marijuana in our code. So in other words, the state, the city, it's just simply how we're doing it, and luckily it's very unique, and so it's how we're measuring it. And what I said was, this is just a measurement issue, that still stands. What I also tried to point out before is, it's completely arbitrary. So that this is an effort to define it, which is good. And I maintain that what the community had come to before, which was, we're not gonna do as a crow flies, that's unreasonable. We're gonna do practical pedestrian route. The Muni employees interpreted practical pedestrian route as wherever there's a side street on a business road, that there is an implied crosswalk. That is arbitrary. And they backed off on it here. They say, okay, well, that's okay, all our stuff about this legality and stuff. For major arterials, you can now, you have to use a marked crosswalk. I would say, just use the marked crosswalks at all times, including, because I want to see what the list of major arterials are. Like, it's probably Tudor, it's probably Minnesota, it's probably, I don't know about Lake Otis, Commercial Drive, Mountain View Drive, I don't know, but some of those probably aren't. West Potter Drive, industrial, I got property on there. It's not really pedestrian friendly, historically it's killed some people. People should probably use marked crosswalks there too, even if it's not a major arterial, because essentially, so that's what I would say. So you've proven now that it is a matter of discretion. They could just as easily say, use marked crosswalks on any business road, anything other than a residential street. So I would advise you to do that. Lastly, I would say, this whole idea that one set of beliefs trumps another set of beliefs, that the Catholic Church, because it's an established religion for 2,000 years versus Scientology or Seventh-day Adventists or Jehovah's, somehow has precedent, their belief system has precedence and needs to be protected, versus a group of people that believe that you should be able to legally sell marijuana. Why is it that you said it was crazy that they should be nearby? I say it's crazy that you would even think that they would have precedence over another set of beliefs, because it's a free country.
Well, it's intensity of use to get to that issue. How, and as Mr. Wells referred to it, create some separations from spheres of influence. And so we were looking at intensity of usage, not length of belief.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Why do they get a trump? Why do they get a trump?
Well, I'm just sort of in defense of Mr. Flynn there. With alcohol licenses, we do have separation distances from schools and from churches, and doing the same thing for marijuana sort of tracks with that precedent. So setting aside, people's opinions on things, we have measured distances between certain uses and other uses. In this case, with alcohol, it's
Well, fair
sensible.
enough, but if we were able to have marijuana where we have alcohol, I think marijuana industry would see it as a totally improved situation where you're proposing this. Because there's a brown jug across Wentworth Junior High. I mean, it's,
I think we've got that. Let me, Stephanie, do you want to address a little bit on the definition of materials and so on?
There's a lot with that. I mean, really, there's.
The map.
Yeah, I have a map and I have a list.
I mean, major, minor, I mean, every road, and that's the difficult thing, every road operates differently. I mean, so when we look at them, it's individual, that's why we have context-sensitive design and looking at individual designs for roadways. When you're talking about Potter, I agree with you that Potter is not pedestrian-friendly because historically it has been industrial, and previous Title 21 standards do not require any pedestrian facilities in industrial areas whatsoever. That is now changing. So as redevelopment happens in industrial areas, we're requiring head and bike facilities with the acknowledgement that, you know, we need to acknowledge all of the different users no matter the area. But to say that the only legal location where you can cross on Potter is Potter and C, because that is the only signalized controlled intersection
Not very
along the
far.
length of Potter. Potter's pretty long. It goes Arctic,
You got-
takes into the side of Arctic.
what you're
you know.
doing on Tudor at the major highway, and you're, if you, sorry.
And say, it just, the reasonableness of this, and that's why I really want to pull Title IX and talking about the legality of these crossing locations out of this. That is a topic for a different discussion. And I agree that it needs to continue, and the safety of people and where they're crossing needs to continue. But how we're measuring these distances, I hate to say, I could care less. I just want, I mean, really, I asked a question to Erica about why we're not doing it like liquor licenses, because to be honest, I have never been pulled into the discussion about liquor licenses. I'm kind of happy with that, because it's one last thing I have to worry about.
I just want to real quick follow up, because Francis said something I thought was interesting about, we've been doing this with liquor licenses, there are these mandated separations. So on Tudor, directly across from from the Gospel Mission is a liquor store. It's far less than 500 feet. So how is that permitted? What was it? Was it because they had to go down to the marked crosswalk and then back around?
The distances for liquor licenses is only 200.
Is there a distance between one option?
I mean,
Yes.
So it might even, but I don't know actually how far is Tudor across? Is it more than 200 feet? I mean, it's literally directly across.
The right of way is probably 70 to 80 feet. From right of way to right of way, I have to pull up to the road a little bit.
So-
If you're looking at 5-lane section, it's pretty much 5 times 12 is probably 60 feet plus the median plus the sidewalks. You are in like the 70 to 80 foot range from across. But I don't know if those measurements are measured from
I mean,
front
it's
door to edge door.
It's front door to front door.
These are literally front door to front door. I would be shocked if it was 200 feet. I mean, it's we've got complaints about it. You know, I mean, it's
All the time.
Forrest,
Every year.
200 feet's not that far. It's really not.
It's not.
Take the wheel out, it's not that far.
Both those buildings sit back on the back end between the property.
Properties. Anywhere going property
Already
to
40 feet either
property line,
side.
it's different.
So I wonder, could you, we have a couple other questions, but if we had a question earlier, is what is
My
the law
question
for
is,
alcohol?
what's the difference standard we use from alcohol storage to marijuana storage? Are we doing 500 for marijuana retail and 200 for alcohol?
Yes.
Why? State law.
Yeah, that's correct.
State law.
So what is it?
So, state regulations on alcohol say that there are two protected land uses. They don't use that terminology, but it says the alcohol licenses have to be 200 feet shortest pedestrian route from the from a alcohol license establishment to a school or a church. And the way I think the state interprets it is it's front door with churches and to the essentially like the schoolyard or the outward property boundary for a school. But the state relies on the municipality to for determinations on this distance, more or less. So what happens in their office with alcohol is the applicant for a license, basically just says, yeah, it meets the distance. The staff there does a quick sort of Google search, tabletop type of thing to try and measure the distance. And if it looks like it's met, then it's met. the muni doesn't have any regulation on separating alcohol licenses from churches or schools, but to try and enforce the state's regulations, we take out a wheel for every alcohol license and measure it according to our interpretation that the state relies on and we really to enforce it on the rule. And it's the same with marijuana.
Francis actually just kind of hit on what I was going to say in part. He did it far better than I would have. But I want to just go back to, because I don't want to see this just, go down to resurfacing the issue of alcohol. Why is alcohol 200 feet? Why is, marijuana 500 feet? The fact of the matter is, the conversations we had, the recommendations from the Department of Law based on federal letters that were written from the DOJ clearly stated the recommendation was 1,000 feet. So I'm not going to argue. I don't want to argue. I think it's a waste of time when we start saying, why aren't we 200 feet? It's move on. We've decided it's 500 feet. Now the question before us is, how are we going to measure it, or what direction are we going to give to staff to measure it? So I just kind of want to get us back on task.
And I have a comment, Mr. Chair, I have a thought on that. So this guidance to staff, it's very well written, it's research, detailed, it describes the different ways, but it's complicated. And, I think staff is smart enough to read this, understand it, and use this, but as someone who has gone out and measured these distances, it's very difficult for this document, this 1 or 2 page document, to cover all instances, no matter how well written it is. Anytime you're not measuring property line to property line, shortest distance, we call it as the crow flies, right? Then it's going to be open to interpretation, and it's going to be complicated, and it's going to be imperfect. It's basically problematic if you don't measure it the way that Eagle River does. If you're doing shortest pedestrian route, it's just always going to be a problem. And the applicants know this because they're measuring that distance, and staff knows this because we're going out there and measuring the distance. I don't know if other folks around the table have ever tried to do this, but you would not believe, do you jump around that bush? Do you go up over the deck till you hit the actual door? Well, yes, you do. But where is perpendicular across the road? Do you go around the fence, or if it's a barrier that's 2 foot high, do you hop over that? I mean, it's unbelievable. So you're going to have a problematic thing if you don't measure shortest distance. If you introduce pedestrian, it's going to be a problem. Now that's a big picture thing. This may be the best way of dealing with it, but if you measure by shortest pedestrian route, it's always going to be a problem.
Is there an amendment to this that you could see that you could come up with that makes it easier for staff?
No, I think Eric has done a fine job, but you read this and then you stand up there.
Try and do it.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go to Janet next, who sent us all a write-up. Just real quick before then is, Stephanie, you had changed one word in particular on line 37, page 2, restricted to control.
Oh, controlled access streets. That's the technical term. Actually, Scott Thomas is the one who recommended that change in my discussion with him. As far as
What is it? Which line? Line 37, page 2.
It's actually on the original is line 30, page 2.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. This is Janet.
Yeah.
Line
So controlled access streets are going to be, those are, well, actually, it's not just highways. I'll say mostly when you think of controlled access, you're going to think of Minnesota south of Tudor is controlled access. The Glen, the Seward, when they're their actual grade separated portions, not when you start getting into town, really, once you hit 36, it's not really controlled access, although they do have controlled access lines. There are, C Street from 40th Avenue south has controlled access lines that really, there's only specific breaks to allow intersections and certain accesses to those roads. Eagle River Road is a controlled access roadway that only allows specific breaks and locations location. So the term controlled access is something that the Federal Highway Administration actually adopts, and the roads basically are registered as having controlled access. And there can be lines that DOT really has adopted. They're different than right-of-way lines, because sometimes the right-of-way and the controlled access lines actually aren't the same. And really, so controlled access is really intended to be controlled. There's only specific access locations defined both for vehicles and for other users, pedestrians and bicyclists. And in a lot of situations for controlled access, pedestrians and bicyclists may be prohibited from using the roadway.
Are they listed like an OSHA here?
No.
Could a list be made that's fairly simple for people?
That would be, I guess that would be a question for DOT. Because as far as I know, I can't think of any specific municipal roadways that are defined as controlled access roadways. Major arterials, as we work with them, when you read the official streets and highways plan, we try to limit the amount of access to an arterial. So an arterial is meant for movement of traffic, and the more driveways and access points you have, it slows down traffic, and actually, it degrades the functionality of an arterial. So we try to control the access, but there actually are specific roads that are controlled access. So mixing of terminology here.
Right, thanks. Can I go to Jana real quick? She's the patient, and she sent to all of us kind of a little rewrite that has some value.
So I have a copy.
We don't have a copy of
Oh,
that.
I have a couple of copies.
We never saw it.
I have your letter, but I think I have it in an
Here's
email.
1, 2, 3, 4 copies. I have it right now.
No, there's something else too, yeah.
So something of the letters you told us?
I think it's in an email.
Yeah, it was the,
Can you just describe it?
Sure.
Thank you.
Basically, what I did was, I kind of on Assemblyman Flynn's line of thought is, the state prohibits schools, 70% for the state applies to schools, rec and youth centers, churches, and correctional facilities. And so if I heard Mr. Flynn explain his rationale, that makes sense, but for the fact that we left out athletic fields and playgrounds, which are two things that aren't covered in the state regulations, that are muni-specific distances or muni-specific sensitive uses. So if that was our line of reasoning, let's carve out for major arterials the muni-specific ones and create that kind of, really sensitive, really protective, and really, sensitive but not as protected delineation. Why didn't we put athletic field and playground into the exemption? And then the other point I would point out is Minnesota Drive, for example, right? We just heard, and I read it in this, highway plan and street plan, that a major arterial, the point of it is to get traffic from one end of the city to the other end without less access points, right? So think about that. That means there's less marked crosses, there's crossways, there's less places for people to actually cross. So really, for a major arterial, this doesn't make any sense because you're actually shortening the measurement. Because if there won't be a crosswalk within 150 feet of most of these uses, because by definition, you're supposed to have less access points. So really what we're doing here is creating we're taking 7 lanes of traffic, but we're making the measurement distance shorter than you would for a smaller street because there's less access points, because the point is to not cross it. So that just doesn't make any sense to me. My suggestion was just to, when measuring the separation distance from any sensitive use other than a school or child care center, the route shall use marked crosswalks, pedestrian tunnels, or overhead walkways where crossing major arterials identified in official streets and highways. When measuring the distance from a school or child care, the route shall cross at crosswalks which exist at all intersections, whether marked with paint or not, unless specifically signed to prohibit pedestrian crossing, regardless of whether the route crosses a major arterial. That's my change, because I think that actually grasps what Mr. Flynn was aiming for. Let's remove all the muni exceptions, because we had this discussion in front of the assembly over and over again. What's a practical pedestrian route? Obviously, given the fact that major arterials are supposed to go from one end of the city to the other with less access points, you wouldn't think that you could cross it at any, that wouldn't be practical. In fact, Minnesota Drive specifically was used as that example in a lot of these discussions. So that would be my point.
for my change there. And then, you know, just the sheer fairness of the public relying on the conversations, the public participating, and then to have it be like, have the conversation change to, oh, no, because you're a major arterial, we're gonna cross at any intersection, even though it's 7 lanes of traffic, and that hopscotch painted on the concrete, even though there's no playground equipment surrounding it, is gonna keep you out of business. I mean, I just think it puts the planners in a really unfair position, and, you know, Francis had to listen to me for an hour on the phone, you know, explain my point of view on this, and it just seems to not really grasp what the intent was. I don't know if that's clear.
Oh, no.
No, go ahead.
So, okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around, your amendment, because when you're saying, okay, first of all, where is it defined what a sensitive use is? Is that actually a term we use in
I
code?
think she means the protected land uses for marijuana that list
Right.
that Mr. Weddleton.
Right, I know what she means, but in here it says sensitive, so that's a problem.
There's no definition.
That's, so you can't, in my view, you can't use that term.
Okay, so that's
Number one, because there's no, I was trying to.
But we are very sensitive to schools and.
Oh, of course, but number two, I don't see how through an AM we can differentiate some protected uses and just say we're not gonna pay attention to these ones. I mean, the fact of the matter is, the protected land uses are the protected land uses, period, no matter what you say in this AM. So I don't find it appropriate to parse out just because the state says it's just these two. Let's just ignore what we said in the municipal code. I don't see that. So I think there's problems with this, and I'd have to have a lot of convincing before I would. I understand what you're saying is, and I think you make valid points about why are we encouraging more people to cross in certain areas. But I think from a legal standpoint, like I said, AMs have no effective law anyway. But the fact of the matter is, I think this introduces more problems than the solutions, personally.
I don't interpret this as ignoring it. I think the first part, it says sensitive use, but it doesn't say protected use. It doesn't ignore it. It takes all of them, puts them there with one way of measuring, and then it takes two, which is school or child.
Well, and
care center,
that's the problem I have.
separate.
I think all protected uses should be viewed the exact same way. I think otherwise you're gonna have a legal argument. The Department of Law is gonna have a problem with this. I'm telling you, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm telling you, when you say this is the rules for protected land use, and then you're like, well, except for these two, I think you have to treat protected land uses when we're looking at them. I think that's how Erica would look at it. I think that's how the Department of Law would look at it. But again, I'd have to have them weigh in. I don't know, Chris, do you have any?
Just to follow up on that comment, I think your assessment's pretty spot on, and while this is an assembly memorandum designed to give guidance to staff interpretation, you're setting up a scenario where we're making us liable for every decision that we make where the applicant disagrees with whether or not that is truly a school, or maybe it's a Montessori and that's not really a school because it's not clearly identified in code. So it's a challenging, interpretation that if I put myself in a business owner's shoes for a second, I wouldn't like adding this extra layer of uncertainty.
So separating the measurements based on use is problematic. Separating it based on arterial or controlled access, that's not as troublesome. Is that good?
I won't speak for Stephanie, but from a planning perspective, receiving direction to interpret which streets we should allow crossing to occur on that are not expressly prohibited in code is, again, in my mind, puts us in a liability situation.
Okay, I just want to go back to what somebody said, is whatever we use here does not encourage people to cross or not. And really, it's just a proxy for keeping those spheres of influence separate. So it seems like we get bogged down in that, encouraging people to cross, and it's really, I don't see how that would
I
happen.
want to redraw the examples that Erica did last time, if I can, on the board, just so we can, I mean, because Boris brought up a good point, and this has been a long-term discussion in regards to safety with my staff as well when we're looking at these things, so. Say this is Tudor Road, for example, so we've got 2 lanes this direction, 2 lanes this direction, and we have a median with various places for allowing crossing. You have a use on this side, and you have a use on this side. Say, this is
our signalized intersection over here.
Golden Donuts on Piper.
You know, and then you have
No, you're
all
right.
the way down here, you have Lake Otis. You know, depending on how you measure these things, and we're not saying that we're encouraging people to cross.
Piper's lit, isn't it?
Piper has a signal, so this has a signal, but this is
Right.
probably more, actually I know for a fact from the uses I'm talking about, this is more than 500 feet away. The distance between Piper and Lake Otis is a half mile, I'm pretty sure. We're a half mile between the two of them. Miles 5,280 feet, so you're about 2,2,800 feet. So, I mean, say you have, you know, a protected land use here, and whether it's a liquor business, a marijuana business, anything here, depending how you measure it. I mean, the thing is when we're looking at 500 feet, if you were to measure it, you know, technically we do have another street over here that is Wright. I'm pretty sure this is Wright Street that is over here. You know, so depending on where you're looking at intersections, you know, and as state code and municipal code says, you know, this intersection at this point in time is not signed as no ped crossing. There's nothing that says, and a lot of people keep using the term jaywalking. That is not the definition of jaywalking. So it'd be, you'd have to sign it no ped crossing. So a pedestrian can legally go here, cross here, you know, come back here, and I don't know what that distance would be. You know, a lot of people will do the Frogger and use the median to get across. But if we're talking about like distances of 500 and we're trying to look at, you know, spheres of influence and how we have these things, the question comes down to whether or not you think this road actually breaks the sphere of influence of these uses from each other. Because we have a situation, you know, on Tudor Road where we have a Mission on one side, and we have a business that's a liquor on the other side, and as the crow flies and the distance from the way it's measured, you know, it's more than 200 feet. And if you were to say, okay, the 200 feet was going to be via like the marked ped crossing, you would actually now be saying that these distances are like more than 1,000 feet away from each other. And is that what we're trying to do with this? Was that the intent? And I guess, like I said, I'm unbiased one way or the other as how we're measuring this. But when you're looking at these distances and what we're trying to do, you know, for 500 feet, almost anything you can have along any major arterial, something directly across the street from it, and I can guarantee you it's going to be per the definitions we're trying to do. If you say that they only can cross at legal locations, it's going to be 500 feet. And you're saying, you know, if it's a church, you know, and the church, if they don't want to see it, it's going to be right across the street. You know, if it's a school and you don't want to see it, it's right across the street. And when you're talking about spheres of influences, there are certain uses that will encourage people to run straight across the street. And we have some of those attractors when you have certain uses. And it's not just a liquor store, it's like we have a gas station, we have all this, we've got a lot of residential and a lot of uses on the other side of the street. And it encourages people to cross the street. So safety is one thing, and then how we're trying to measure this is something else completely. But this is an example, this is a real life example of something that has been permitted and has caused issues, safety issues.
Stephanie, before you step away from the board,
Yeah.
can you perhaps illustrate or define some additional terms in Jana's, well, in the updated draft that we're looking at? And I don't know if any of these exist on here, and forgive my ignorance on your traffic lingo, but what is a location? The route shall never be across controlled access streets, over or through fences, I get that one, or at locations prohibited by a traffic control device. What does that mean?
Sign.
So if there's a sign that says no ped crossing at Wright Street, which you just described, there isn't one, then that would count. Okay.
Yes.
What other types of traffic control devices are there besides signs?
I mean, any markings, so stripe,
Okay.
sign, signal.
Okay.
I mean, really, those are the primary. I mean, electronic devices, I mean, you could have a sign that flashes, but generally, I mean, that is a traffic control device.
Great.
So mediums don't count.
No, well, the median, and that, I guess that is a different question, because for Minnesota, when you're looking at Minnesota, at Wright Street, there's a break in the median. There's actually, I mean, there's turn lanes, there's everything like that. There is a break in there, I mean, there's a clear location where people can actually cross. And something that when you're looking at Minnesota is controlled access pretty much except at signalized intersections. There's very few locations where there's breaks. Some of them are U-turns, they're not exactly at intersections. And I believe the way the state interprets that is with, I mean, when you have a complete median there and there's no break in it anywhere for there like even to be pedestrian crossings, as far as I see it, they see that as a controlled access. In the sense that, you know, say this is the intersection of Spenard, you know, and you do not have another signalized intersection until you hit Benson. And there is one break at 32nd Avenue, but it's a right turn only, and it actually doesn't create a clear line of sight for pedestrians. As far as DOT defines that, I am pretty sure that between Spenard and Benson, that is controlled access and is not intended to be crossed, except at those signalized intersections. They did not put a break. Because the thing is when you provide access, then it has to be accessible as well. Because if you're saying that me as an able-bodied person can cross it and it was intended to allow us to cross there, you have to make it accessible as well. So you'd have to actually put a break and make it flush and put a refuge for somebody that is actually going to be either in a wheelchair, have a walker, do things like that. And so usually there's a break to allow not just an able-bodied person, but anybody to use that. And that is not the case along much of Minnesota.
Can I ask you a question?
Let me actually, this is a process thing. We're at 9:53-ish, and we have another fairly big topic after. This one is somewhat critical because the industry's relying on the definition, and we're tripping over it. The other one is not quite as, because state law doesn't let us do it anyway. So Laurel and Fred and friends, we brought donuts for you. And others can share because they're very generous, so feel free. Should we postpone the other one, or where are we? Because I don't think we have time to get to that. This one we're still fairly deep in. Any recommendations?
We do have another meeting next week too, don't we?
We have a number of marijuana ones on that might slow us down. We have a
So we
meeting.
just stay longer and get it done?
Yeah.
Are we allowed to stay longer?
No, we stay.
If you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, and there's a lot of people who have a lot of interest in both topics, I actually hope the second one won't take that long. And you know, some of my former neighbors joined for that. So if we could take that up for a few minutes, I would appreciate it. And we can cut off discussion at 15. If there's unresolved issues, I'll take them up offline and bring it back to the committee later.
I had a bunch on.
That's why I called you.
What do you think?
Well, I think there's a couple different scenarios. I don't mind shifting this and going to the other issue and then coming back to this one today. But also, if we were to put this under old business too for next week, I think we've started to flesh out some of the issues and questions people have. It might give people a couple days to problem solve some of the things they've heard today. Just an idea.
So we could kind of end this, move on to that, and then make this on the next agenda. How many do we have on that next week? Three.
They've all been
They're all
going relatively quick.
Retail's a little different, but
Yeah.
so we could possibly do those in 45 minutes. So that's not happening.
Stephanie, one question.
Yes.
Stephanie, on the other end of Tudor Road, coming from the new Seward Highway, where is the next, going towards Lake Otis, where is the appropriate pedestrian crossing? At McGinnis, or do you have to go all the way down from the new Seward Highway to Lake Otis?
There are no medians except directly next to the new Seward Highway where they were trying to control the access as you're approaching the highway and the interchange. So if that, McGinnis is a legal crossing location, even though it is not signalized. There was nothing prohibiting crossing there.
Okay. So coming from Shelikoff, the next way to get across legally would be at McGinnis?
Shelikoff, no, it'd be the highway,
Yeah, closest to Shelikoff is actually going back to the interchange.
closer to Lake Otis.
Yeah, and it's going back to that, and with the medians that are there, and Shelikoff does have medians there, kind of limiting it to a left in, right out only, and there is no clear line of sight really for pedestrians. There's nothing there prohibiting pedestrian crossing, so I don't know whether a cop seeing somebody cross there, whether they would ticket them for jaywalking or not. I don't know for
I've
sure.
got a friend cop lives over there, I'm gonna ask him
Yeah.
a question.
Yeah, I don't know. I will
Thank you,
say they're
John.
very hesitant to ticket for that though.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
That thing. Okay, so we have, I think we'll hit a point on this where we've highlighted some issues, and it might be better to go back to staff, particularly Eric, who's gone now, but we'll be back. So let's go around, get a round of questions on this, and that'll give us time to look at Patrick's, and then what we can do is schedule this for part of the next meeting. And next meeting we'll schedule for 2 hours, just in case we need it. Does that work? Did you get that, Jamel? Okay,
So that'd be
Jana?
a week from today,
Yeah, 13th.
the 13th. Okay, starting at 9.
Yeah.
All right, then I was making sure I was available if you wanted me to be here.
Okay, so we'll go Jana, then Forrest, and then you.
Okay, can I just ask you a question? So for that Spinar to Benson, so there is a sign that says pedestrian crossing 1,500 feet. Does that mean you have to go to that?
No.
Okay, so
No, this is a whole nother topic of conversation. Prior to the intersection of Northern Lights, when you're heading, and this depends on the direction. I did not do my north correctly.
say we're coming from Spinar to
So if you're coming from Spinar to Benson, where that sign has been located, what that sign is supposed to indicate, that is a warning sign saying pedestrians, next 1,500 feet. Acknowledging the fact DOT put that sign up, acknowledging the fact that that area specifically is one that's very common for pedestrians to jaywalk. And trying to warn drivers, don't be surprised when there's pedestrians in the roadway.
it says pedestrian crossing 1,500 feet.
It doesn't say pedestrian crossing, it is just a pedestrian warning sign. It is the warning, it is the yellow, and they did it very large. I mean, they have that, I mean, and it has the walking, the walking ped, and then it has below it the 1,500 feet.
Right, yeah,
That's all it is. So, I mean, that is a warning sign that it like indicates to people. Those are supposed to be used in locations where, you may not see that there is a pedestrian crossing coming up to warn vehicles that there's something that could be in the roadway. When you have a blind intersection, when you have locations, a bike path that happens to come into the side of the roadway, you want to warn people about. But that has been identified as a high crash location and a high risk location for pedestrians because they do scamper back and forth between a lot of the different uses because there's residents on one side, there's businesses on the other, there's back and forth, especially through Northern Lights Benson, those intersections. So they put them on both sides, like kind of approaching the couplet because they have it when you're heading southbound. They did it right before or after the school. I mean, really, and then they did it the other direction in that area. And to be honest, they did that for liability purposes.
okay. And then, so you're saying from Spinar to Benson, that where there's not a break, that is not a legal pedestrian crossing?
That would be considered controlled access.
So that's.
I mean, even on Tudor Road, in the locations where there's not a break in the median, that is considered controlled access. So, perfect example, if you come out here to Elmore Road and you look to the east to where Tudor Center is, there is not a break in that median until you get to the signal of Tudor Center. There is the other side of Tudor Center because it loops, does tee into the side of Tudor Road, but that is not a legal crossing location because it is completely medianed. It is not intended for access for any travelers, whether it's vehicles, pedestrians, or anything.
Okay.
So really, between Elmore and Tudor Center, those are it ends up being that the only legal crossing location are the signalized intersections. Or
that would be
the
similar-
overpass, because there is an overpass as
And
well.
that would be similar in that situation?
It's similar in that situation as well.
Okay, that helps me understand.
Okay, Forrest?
So, yeah, real quickly, so first, if you leave this meeting and you drive west along Tudor,
Yep.
I urge you to look at right
Yep.
and think about how breathtakingly dangerous it would be to walk across there, especially in the winter. And that is what our community council has been urging us to try to get resolved. Second, to what Amy said about, this doesn't have the force of law, well, I would argue that probably the planning department is going to take it under advisement when they do these interpretations. But I kind of want to disagree with the point about the protected uses because unless the term shortest practicable pedestrian route is otherwise defined in our code or in the state law, then we do have flexibility in how we determine this. And especially the word practicable, that's like the reasonable person standard in the law. And that allows for a lot of flexibility. So for example, if you wanted to make a distinction between schools and public housing facilities, well, schools have kids that could be running back and forth across a road. And we think of that reasonably as being different from adults walking from a public housing facility. So I think we do have the ability to do a lot of work here because this term is not otherwise defined in law. So.
Okay, thank you. Hugh, briefly.
I totally agree with Amy. The more you slice and dice this stuff, the more you climb into a rabbit hole. So,
Welcome to my
just
world.
for simplicity, just for pure execution and measurement.
We should go back to the crow flies.
You should, no, well, you could do that and maybe shorten it up, but we're not gonna do that. So, what we got to was, we got to practical pedestrian route. And they've said it a bunch of times, we can talk all about safety and wonkishness and what's crossing or not, but it really doesn't matter. It's simply a matter of measuring practical pedestrian route. And so, stick with those uses, keep the measurement the same for each. And I would say you're making the same freaking mistake on starting to slice and dice what's a major arterial and what's a residential street and what's a feeder, a commercial feeder. Another big mistake. You simply say, for your purposes, practical pedestrian route means people will cross at crosswalks, at marked crosswalks. Because it really didn't have anything to do with human behavior. It just is simply a measurement issue, and it doesn't have anything to do with any of this stuff here. It's just how this staff is gonna measure this stuff. Big picture, we're talking about trying to fight the black market with legal business here. If you make it more restrictive on how you measure it and more simple, and you use crosswalks, there's gonna be more property opened up. And you're gonna have buildings that would have otherwise not been used now have more demand from tenants, higher property values, higher property taxes, and you're gonna be fighting the black market. It's just a smart thing to do. Cross at marked crosswalks for the definition of this practical pedestrian use. It doesn't have anything to do with safety.
Thank you. Kathy?
Yeah, thank you. Again, Kathy Gleason, Trinidad Community Council. So once again, I feel like I'm the only person in the room from a kind of a community public perspective, which is unfortunate because I think they ought to be at the table if others are at the table besides committee members, providing input. But I have to disagree with you. I mean, I agreed with you up until a point that don't complicate it. Make it simple, come up with a measurement and stick with it. But the purpose of this, I go back to what John said at the last meeting I attended, which was a couple weeks ago, and what you had said earlier. This isn't about creating the easiest way for someone to get from a protected area to a marijuana business. It is creating a separation from these defined protected uses from a marijuana establishment. And I think you have really gotten off track with this unfortunate practical pedestrian route definition. And so it is not about legal versus black market. That is not what this is about. This is about keeping a separation, and it has to be measured in distance versus sphere of influence, unfortunately, because there is no way to define sphere of influence, although I love that phrase.
It's a colonial space. It will be more than China.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Of course it'll be more than China.
Between
British.
things like
US military.
athletic fields and daycare centers, and we see the list of how it's defined. Keep those away. Keep those areas away from marijuana establishments. That's the task of this committee, and I think it's just getting so complicated about crosswalks and medians and whether they're marked or not, and whether it's a major arterial. It just seems like you are forgetting what the purpose of this part of the code is, and you have to define separation. Thank you.
Good, thank you. So what I'd like to do then is maybe go around to committee members, and if you're gonna postpone this and say, okay, let's give staff something to chew on, maybe you have a few comments and say what exactly that guidance is. Start with Amy.
I just recommend, I can solve it all, you guys can just measure lot line, I'm just saying. But, no, I do, I wanna take a couple, a day or so to digest, and I'm actually gonna go back and re-listen to the audio and digest what everybody said, and I think then I'll come up with my questions. I'm happy to email the questions to you, John, if you wanna send them out to everybody, that's fine. But I know I need a little bit of clarification, because I think you're right, I think the whole point of protected land use is to have a protected land use. I don't think, my goal is not to bend over backwards to make this easier to give more property to the marijuana industry. My goal is to protect the protected land use, so I think there's a little bit of work to do there.
Thank you. Pete?
I just think we need to go with marked crosswalks. I just think that is common sense to me. I don't want to be, I mean, some people say we're not encouraging people to cross at a non-marked crosswalk, but I think if you don't make the practical route of the crosswalk, then we are. So I just think that's common sense.
Yeah.
Chris, got a question for you. Going through these protected land classes, are city dedicated parks protected land class?
Yes.
They are, because they're not
No.
listed.
No, they're not.
They are in Eagle River.
Dedicated.
They're not here.
No, athletic fields and
Actual
playgrounds and
dedicated city
associated parking for those athletic fields and playgrounds are, I think, dedicated parkland only in Eagle River. I haven't,
No, we actually
none of the
have
applicants
here in
have been in Eagle River, so I haven't had to work on that one.
I have one here in Midtown, Walter Park, dedicated park land.
Well,
It's not a protected land use.
well,
Well,
it has
has
a
Not for
sport
marijuana.
field on it.
Doesn't it?
So, yes,
It
that's the
does.
only, that's the only thing we're hanging our hat on, is dedicated athletic fields, not the facts of dedicated parkland.
Right.
But
Okay. Thank you.
That was changed when you guys deliberated.
We can change it back.
Of course.
I've already
Um,
asked that.
But feel free.
It seems like we were pushing more, so you created this term shortest practicable pedestrian routes because you recognized at the time, and I was on the assembly, that if you went to as a crow flies in Anchorage proper, you're going to make it impossible for almost any businesses to open in this community. Now, if you wanted to do that and you wanted to force the marijuana industry out of Anchorage, you should have used the clause that was in the ballot initiative and pulled us out, just opted us out. But that attempt failed 9-2. And I think the reason was because we recognized we didn't want Anchorage to be completely pulled out of the marijuana industry. And if that's the case, then we have to be practical in how we set up our regulations. And what's right for Eagle River, which is a much different kind of community and more spread out and rural, is not right for a lot of other parts of Anchorage. And that is, I believe, why you came up with this term, shortest practicable pedestrian route. And now you have the opportunity to define it in the real world, accounting for things like people running across Tudor Road. And so I do think you want to be thoughtful about how you define this term. And you don't want to define it in such a way where it's basically just as a crow flies, or in some other way where the industry is no longer able to function.
All right, thanks. Who else? Is that all of us? I just a few comments is I find that this practice, I don't want to restrain the industry, but I do want to focus, we do have these protected uses and we should respect that. And I'm finding the more and more we talk about it, that the practical pedestrian system simply doesn't work to do that. And I understand that as a crow flies can be too restrictive. So I'm not happy with any of it. I haven't thought of a better way, but I almost think to protect some of this stuff so you don't have this instance where you have a marijuana right across from the highest user group of high school, for example. You maybe combine and say, okay, you have to be minimum 200 as the crow flies, and then you can use whatever pedestrian route we choose. But that would just at least offset them a bit. But that's the concept I haven't measured or thought of it. It would set sort of a minimum, so you want to have something running across the street. So anyway, I think we should wrap this up. We'll put it on the agenda for the next meeting. We'll make that meeting 2 hours. And probably start with the marijuana applications to make sure we get through those and then get back to this.
Just so you know, I will actually be in Homer on the 13th for the start, so I won't physically be here.
You can even call them if you really want to. I don't know what the rules are on that, but does that work?
Yeah.
Let's get on to the tax abatement. What is that? Good. So, tax abatement, do you want to start, Patrick?
Great, thank you.
Wait a minute, I didn't give you a chance to do your instructions, I'm sorry.
I have one.
Feel free to email or. Okay. Go ahead.
So, could I welcome a few folks to the table?
You guys can sit up at the table. If you eat a donut.
Is that the requirement?
So, I think those of you who have had the misfortune of sitting at the assembly meeting with me when we discussed deteriorated findings and tax abatement packages, know that I'm not particularly fond of the existing tax abatement structure that we have. It's very complicated. It's basically inaccessible to all the most sophisticated developer. And it really doesn't provide any incentivization for smaller scale redevelopment. And the genesis of this legislation was actually sitting down with my former neighbor, hopefully future neighbor, Laurel Spencer, and she was family home was vacated when her father passed away about a year ago now, and the family is trying to figure out how to redevelop the property. And there's what they ran into is an issue that I've seen in a lot of different jurisdictions where it's not the cost of dirt that prevents you from developing, although that's an issue. It's the cost of dirt plus the cost of the improvements on it, even though they're old, all but unusable, and yet they have value on the tax rolls. And so if you want to buy that property, you're paying for the dirt plus the cost of the structure, which you then have to pay to raise in order to redevelop the property. And so I thought, okay, is there a way to provide some incentive to redevelop those properties? And I spent a fair amount of time with Chris, with Dean Gates, with Bill Falsey, with, I always forget, our assessor, Brian, thank you, Brian Holmes, trying to figure out how do we structure this simply, easily accessible, so that as we redevelop Anchorage, there's an incentive to do that adds value and ultimately benefits all taxpayers. So what you see before you is a remarkably brief ordinance given the top subject matter. It says, okay, you got a building that's 45 years old, and you want to knock it down and replace it with something that the permit value, when you go to get your permits, is 150% of the value of what you're knocking down. And you get 3 years tax abatement. And it's from when you finish your permit structure, or your permit application. So 3 years where you're not paying taxes on that parcel, period. If it's a 30-year-old building, 2 years. If it's a 15-year-old building, 1 year. And if you don't actually execute the project within 6 years, you gotta pay it all back. It's designed to be as simple as possible. We had a lot of discussions on what ifs and so on and so forth. So that's what I put before you. I invited, I did not actually consult with Laurel when I put this together, but since it was a conversation with her that inspired me to do it, I thought it'd be nice to invite her and see if she had any feedback from her perspective, and that's all.
And just real quick for, so is this recorded, so we should say who's here?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a couple newcomers related, Al Hart's here and then,
We were here for the previous one.
oh, okay, he was visiting us, and then Fred and Laurel Stutzer and.
My sister Gretchen.
Gretchen. Good, thank you, and then,
I think, well, we go till 10:30, right? Or what time do we go to?
10:30.
Yeah, I'll tell you at 10:30. Can I ask a couple questions?
okay, Amy.
Okay, so I haven't in detail scrutinized this yet, but just listening to what you're saying and briefly looking at it, I agree with you. I actually was a big supporter of your redevelopment zone that we created. I think these abatements are a very good way to make our city refreshed, let's put it that way. And I think you're right. I think we do have to look at this stuff for, smaller developers, maybe single property owners. My question is, why did you choose to give a full abatement on the entire property instead of, separating out the structure from the land?
We discussed that at length, and the simple answer is, it's really complicated for the assessors to divide the two, for the purposes of taxation.
Okay, so on my green card though, it
Okay.
says land value.
I know, it's the.
And it says house value.
I know, but, in talking with Brian, he said it would be easier for them to administer, because the chain, you have it, they don't have an easy way of pulling the tax burden, tax bill for the cost of the property out of the tax bill they send you. It's a software issue.
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, in part, I don't understand why, okay, I'm not gonna, this is one I can't let go, because I have, if they wanna decide on the value, why can't they just look at my 2015 and say the land value was, $20,000 in 2015, going forward, and the house on it was, $180,000, so I have a $200,000 property tax assessment. I'm knocking down the house, next year, I'm just gonna call it $20,000, why can't they just do that?
I don't know.
Yeah, so the challenge isn't in the assessment side of saying your property was worth this much year over year, and your house that you just torn down is now worth 0 because you tore it down.
Yeah.
Where the snag happens is once that data or information is plugged into CAMA and then transmitted to Treasury for calculating property taxes and sending you your card, that's where we lose the control. There is not the ability to, without the assessor just sort of arbitrarily saying, I'm gonna call the value of your house 0, even though you've torn it down and you've built a new building. There is no mechanism for the actual issuance of your tax obligation that separates those two things out. So literally, what all the Treasury Department can do is take those two numbers and spit out a single amount of taxes due. They don't have the granularity that seems like should be easy to do from a common sense standpoint, but they can't do that portion.
The issue.
That's still not I understand what you're saying, really, Frank. Well, that's not an acceptable answer.
Are they trying to help you? Okay, it's not when the lot is vacant that it's a problem. Okay, it's when you rebuild.
Sure.
And there's a value associated with the house, that's where the problem is.
So, yeah, I know, I totally understand what you're saying, but my challenge is, especially if somebody has 6 years to build a house, so now you own a piece of parcel in the municipality of Anchorage, maybe somebody has the best intentions, life happens, and then they just don't have the ability to build. So basically, they're not gonna pay taxes at all on that piece of property until they rebuild, or that 6 years comes up in the mail.
No, your abatement is only for as prescribed in the code. So 3 years if the structure was 45 years or older, 2 years if it's 30 years or older, 1 year if it's 15 years or older. But the requirement that the structure be replaced with a higher value is not done within 6 years, then you have to pay that all back. It's the hammer.
Yeah, and I like that part.
Yeah, so
Not surprising, right?
and the reason we fixed it too.
No, I like the theory of this, I really do, but I think we need to tweak, we have to do something, because, I get what you're saying, though.
If I were a genius, I wouldn't bother talking to you.
But you are, Patrick.
Boris? So I had two, first of all, I love the overall concept of trying to do this, and we've been talking about different ways to try to incentivize. I guess 2 or 3 really quick things.
Sure.
And I have read through it, but if a developer were to buy a relatively large piece of land with a small old house on it, and then knock it down and then build something much, much larger, are you saying they get a tax write-off on that entire value for 3 years?
If it's a 45-year-old structure, yes.
Okay, so,
And
that's interesting. So there probably are lots like that, right, where we're not really envisioning it, but some developer is going to find some little shack and be like, well, I'm gonna knock down this little shack, it was worth $30,000, and I'm gonna build $1 million facility, which is great in some ways, but it also means they get a complete write-off for 3 years, and that's interesting, right? So the second point on that is, first of all, I'd love if we could find a way to include surface parking in this, which we talked about surface parking lots, which just don't have structures, but I'd love to see redeveloped, and maybe we could have a different ordinance for that. And the last thing is, have you gotten any pushback, and this is very early, I know, but this really incentivizes, so we have some, I think it's a charming older houses around town that are quite nice. And have you gotten any pushback from the sort of Historical Preservation Society kind of folks that are like, you know what you're gonna do, you're incentivizing us knocking down all the old style log homes and building McMansions, basically?
So, it's an excellent question. No, but then again, I don't know that we had a chance to review this yet. And in fact, the Historic Preservation Commission did ask me to introduce an ordinance that would provide a pause on historic or potentially historic properties prior to redevelopment. I thought I forwarded that to you, John, to take a look at.
I have it to take a look at.
Okay, so they asked if I'd introduce it. I said, well, I need to talk to John first before I start jumping off that bridge. But I think there's ways to balance that, and that would be one mechanism for doing that. So it doesn't necessarily prevent you from doing something, but it says, okay, we're gonna take a look and see if there's another. We're gonna give ourselves time to think through those things if it's an historic property.
Mr. Chair, may I make a motion to extend for 10
Yeah,
minutes?
please do, got a second.
10 minutes?
Going on.
We will get to you in a minute. I just want to point, this speaks to what Amy said and what Forrest did a little bit. I just trying to get a grip on how effective this would be, did a little math. And it is interesting, the Northern Lights Inn would be very comparable to a large lot with a very small building. It's a large building, but it's only valued at $25,000. You would suspect it was grossly overvalued. But since you would get the abatement on the entire assessed amount, they could take that and someone could take a small building, they could tear it down, put a $37,000 building on it, and get roughly $100,000 in tax abatement over 3 years. I don't know how old that building is, assuming it's 40, but, so all this math assumed 3 years. And they would get, 260% benefit. That tax abatement would be vastly more valuable than what they built. And I have a couple others. Ammo Can is on Spinard Road near Benson. The old appliance store is down about 40 or something next to the head shop Popeyes. And these, if they built something just at 150% of what the current assessed value is, so they'd probably do something more. But where they did just do barely to qualify, they get 7 to 8%. The tax abatement would be about 7 to 8% of the value of what they built. I just want to get a sense, is this enough to sway a decision? Or is it just just something out there to benefit for you, but you'd have done it or not done it anyway? We got a case study here.
Well, in a way, a little bit of a case study because we are in the process. Again, I'm Fred Stutzer. My wife Laurel and her sister Gretchen grew up on this piece of property that we're talking about, stone's throw away from where Patrick lives. And some of this discussion brought up another issue that I didn't think of. We have 4 separate lots, 2 of which have structures on them. The other 2 are vacant. So really what we're talking about would only apply to those 2 lots that have structures on them, improvements on them. So, that there's always different nuances when you start reading into this. But as far as, Patrick's cover letter, talks about revitalizing, older properties that have extended beyond their useful life. I mean, this is the poster child for that type of a project. This is what we're talking about here. The family home was built in the 50s, went through the earthquake, patched together, and it reached the end of its useful life. However, the proposed ordinance, the way it's written, while I think we'll speak to it in terms of the spirit of what we're trying to do here, I'm totally supportive of that, and I think that's everybody else is in agreement with that. But the way the ordinance is written doesn't apply to us because in the eligibility criteria it says that you need to apply for this exemption before you demo the building. Well, we've already done that.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah. So no, but you're gonna have issues like that where whenever you implement a new ordinance, I mean, there's gonna be some gray area where there's gonna be a line where you're either on one side of the line or the other, and we find ourselves on the other side of the line. Doesn't mean I don't want to speak in favor of what we're trying to do here, but it doesn't apply to us. The other piece that I feel is a little problematic with the way it's written is in the application procedure, it says that you need to have your permits for demo in hand, your permits for building in hand, and that needs to be in a complete package, and you bring it forward to the building department or wherever to get your application or exemption approved. Well, if there's anything that I've learned, or that the three of us have learned in the property development business, that it's not a straight line like that. There's no way. I mean, look at us. We've already demoed the house, and we're still in a concept design. We don't even know what we're building there yet. And the reason we did that is because we're trying to be good neighbors. I mean, the house, let's be honest, used for life. We weren't going to have it occupied. And to prevent unauthorized use, we thought it's better for us and the neighborhood to make the house go away, and that's what we did. And so I think that part of the way the ordinance is written, I think is a little problematic. I mean, I think you're gonna have a really hard time finding people that are gonna have all those things in place, you know, months before it happens, and have that part of the application process. So that was just one thing that I thought well, those two things I would bring up on that.
Okay, that's fine. I just want to go back. I can wait. I just want to ask him a specific question. Specific to your demolition, so when did you demolish or take the building off the property?
In August.
So in August of this year. So when your green card comes out, I'm assuming you're gonna appeal your tax assessment.
Well,
if they come out.
yeah, that's a very good question. I was talking to Laurel about that this morning. I said, I'm not gonna wait till the green card comes
Yeah.
out. I'm
You're gonna go down
go
and
to
say-
the meeting and say, you know what, the house is gone. You need to take the land or the improvement value off of our assessment.
That's kind of my point.
I was thinking when you were saying that.
If there's a mechanism to do that, which there are obviously, I put a donut on it. They're gonna be successful in getting their property tax assessment diminished to the land value, and that'll move forward. I don't see why that part's complicated. Because you might have to go through an appeal, I don't know, but I mean, obviously, I do it at the borough all the time. I have property in the borough. And I can't tell you how many years I've gone and argued with them about the tax, and they just change it right there. It's really not a big deal. So, I'm curious to see how that'll work.
Well, I am too, and I'm assuming that's the right process. I go to the assessor's office and say, the building's gone. You want to see a picture? It's not there anymore. I mean, I don't know how can they argue that, no, there's still value in the improvement when it's not there anymore.
Exactly, and that's why I say I've had the experience with land assessment, not in the city, but in the borough. And, I have found when the assessor comes out to the property and they see what you're talking about, they're like, oh yeah, no problem. And they just change it.
Right.
So.
Can I go real quick to Hugh and then Hugh?
This is super exciting. There's, especially because you're talking about at the micro level as opposed to, this could apply to, anything that's this age. I'd say so, but proceed with caution, because how's it gonna get abused, or where are the pitfalls? Like, okay, like Amy said, they tear it down, they get the abatement, something happens, death of family, emergency, 6 years goes, they have to sell it. They gotta sell this now. I'm assuming this right to abatement here goes with the property, not with the person. And the new buyer is unaware that it expires in 6 years, and like, oh, new buyer, surprise, you owe some money to the community because, that prior owner had this abatement and it wasn't, it's going to be recorded on the title or whatnot, so that can be problematic. I think to the question about these downtown homes, you have a contrast between South Edition where you have old homes that are worth a boatload of money. Even with this abatement, it doesn't make sense to tear them down. They're so valuable. But Mountain View is another story, which is Mountain View, which is they put fourplexes on 6,250 square foot lots. And that is, the destiny of those buildings is they will be slumlord city until they fall to the ground. Because the improvements are so valuable, the only person that was buying in that neighborhood was Cook Inlet, and they were able to only do it for single family, and they got tax credits. They had to get tax credits to make it economically feasible. So this could apply to fourplexes, in Mountain View too. So
that's actually one of the target audiences that I was thinking of. And John, to your question about your comment about take down a $20,000 building and put up a $35,000 building, get all this land in the baby. reason I chose permit value as the standard is because permit value is almost every single time far lower, not just lower, far lower than assessed value. Because permit value is a plug and chug spreadsheet, square feet, garage,
That's the multiplier and then done.
yeah.
What happens outside the BSA when you just have a land use permit? Is it calculated the same way?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
If it's outside the building safety area where you.
Because I love this concept. I have a lot of property in Birchwood. Right away I'm thinking I should go knock on the neighbor's door. So, but my question,
If you
because
don't get a
I
permit,
want
you don't
this
do it.
to apply throughout the entire municipality.
Well, then just come on into the BSA.
No. No, not interested. But again,
The short answer, Mr. Chairman, to your question is, and I hate to say it, but nobody around that table dreamt of Eagle River property as qualifying, so we did not.
we're never thought.
We didn't
I
take
understand.
BSSA, outside of BSSA into consideration, but I will get you an answer.
And we also have parts of the hillside.
Well, that's why I said I can see a value in Indian. I can see them.
Yeah, we were trying to find a simple measurable standard, and that's why we take permit value. You know, if you use an assessed value, then, you know, for example, if you do want to divorce land from improvement, now you don't know how much you're forgiving, because you know what the assessed value is going to be.
Well, I would just say if you go to the previous
Yeah,
calendar year.
and you don't know that you're not getting any guarantee if you don't have a permit that says what you're gonna build, you're not getting a guarantee of what you're getting out of it. The purpose of this is to increase values, so you're collecting sufficient property taxes so that the property tax payers who are paying for the abatement are made whole long-term. So if you say, okay,
I understand what you're saying.
you know, knock it down, then you know, just back what you had, then taxpayers are paying for something they're not getting those benefits. That's not fair.
Okay, and yeah.
Thank you. Did Robert Harris look at this or see it?
I don't think so.
He's asking about fiscal zone. So the challenge would be you don't know how many people are going to use this program.
Well, and the reason we specifically didn't put a C in was because long-term, we actually end up better off.
Oh, it's fine.
No, so
Because you're increasing values.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I like the concept. I just think it's a draft.
It's a draft. Well, no, it's actually submitted, but.
Yeah, I know, but I'm saying it's not
We
right.
got 5 minutes each.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, what you said made me think of this question. So, we're gonna allow someone to redevelop property and sell it, and the tax abatement will go to the new owner, or it's only for the people that's actually doing the building and,
Tax abatements always go with the property.
Yeah.
okay, all right.
Also, the penalty for not being.
Yeah.
1235. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, to answer that question that came up earlier, in 1235, if you sell the property, the abatements do not continue with the new ownership.
Oh, no, but the old owner doesn't keep the abatements.
Right.
Sorry. I was, so, yes and no, Pete. The tax abatement, like, if it's not yet done, or if you haven't gotten all 3 years of it, for example, and you sell, then it terminates. But the old owner doesn't keep it.
Right.
They'll give a tax credit or something like
Right,
that.
right.
And the new owner's on the hook. That doesn't
Right.
happen. So, I'm sorry, I misunderstood the potential question.
I think this is workable. I think there's a little. I'm thinking of amendments already.
God love you.
But no, I like the concept.
You know, so I wanted to figure out what to do with this in here, because I like the concept too.
And I also want to clarify one thing, I think everyone knows this, but just, none of this is legal under state statute, right? Whatever we do, then we have to go and get approval at
Sure.
state level.
Yeah.
So, whatever you think of, I'm open to ideas, but let's remember, the more complicated we make this, the harder it makes it to convince state legislators to go along.
No, and I'm actually thinking of things I think to make it simpler for the person.
Okay.
A couple things that I've looked at this. One is I agree with Forrest that it doesn't include reusing old buildings, which I did recently, and I think there's a lot of buildings, you know, the walls are good, you know, but it's unusable in its current format, but you can rebuild it. So that I think that's a concern. You cut off probably a lot of great value, you get incentive to tear down and not reuse, which is a problem. Another thing I worry a little bit when we do this, that it may maybe weaken some tools we have for increasing workforce housing, for example, which may also use tax incentives and so on. Which one do they stack, or is this one replaces the other? And in case you may tear down a building to do, let's say it's in Mountain View and you replace it with a single family home, and maybe have some incentive, you have to at least meet X number, can't decrease the number of units, or meet the maximum that's allowable on the lot size and the zoning or something, so you increase workforce housing. Which complicates it, but, you know, our goal here is to redevelop unusable property into something useful, and that increases the usefulness of the community. And then there's some where you say the building must be assessed value, has to make up the majority of the assessed value, not attributable to land value. And there's some cases, and I think in the Shell station on the corner of Northern Lights in Minnesota, you got the gas station, it's pretty nice, but you got the old car wash thing, which is a spunky old building. Let's tear that down, put something glorious there. But my guess is that is not the primary value. There's two buildings, that's a very low value building. But I think within the goal of this, we could just tear that one down and rebuild. So that.
And the purpose of that clause was sort of to address your concern about it.
Beg your pardon?
The portion, or the recollection, the reason we added that clause was to address your concern about the North Lights edge. You know, we basically take something worthless, put something only slightly more worthwhile up, and you're not really increasing value to the area, and it benefits the taxpayers.
But Northern Lights Inc. is still doing this though, because it's a white building.
Actually, only if the facility were with higher value than the land.
Yeah,
Well, this is
there's
higher
a specific clause in there, John, that's why your one example of the calculations on Northern Lights, while fascinating, don't actually work, because Patrick included specific prohibition against the value of the building, or land being greater than the building.
Oh, I missed that. I was looking at E5.
This is on page 2, eligibility criteria, line 16. Own real property, at least partially comprised of an existing building, yada, 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 assessed value that makes up a majority of the portion of the assessed value for the real property, not attributable to land
I
value.
missed that, thank you.
But higher.
So I think there's a lot of people who would make amendments. So how do we proceed here? Do we bring it
Well-
back here and put those together?
This might be something for work session.
Well, we can't take action in a work session either, but
Would be
one of the
better.
things, we do have another meeting next week before our next assembly meeting. My recommendation would be everybody draft amendments or suggestions or ideas for amendments, because Erica will do that too.
Or questions for
She's
staff.
out.
And I
Yeah,
don't
staff
know
can
that
help.
She's back next week.
Oh, she's not.
That's a good idea. We need to work here on the document before we send it to the
Yeah.
assembly for work session. We'll make amendments there.
So my
Get the work done at this committee level.
My recommendation would be to bring this back under old business next week. We're gonna have a busy week next
Well, we
week.
could, but I think if we have these points,
Yeah.
so who does it go to though? Who's working on this?
Send it through my office.
So we'll send to you any of our concepts if you can work.
Questions or concepts, or if you need extra information presented at next week's meeting.
So,
Keep in mind,
Chris,
Patrick's
can I
right.
ask you-
Juno's got to weigh in on this. No matter what we do, they've got to make them.
Yeah, but-
Chris, so can you coordinate to help us draft amendments?
Yes.
Okay, we got 0 minutes. You very briefly.
It's interesting you guys want to start doing amendments and stuff, and I assume there's probably been a lot more thought put into it than I'm giving you credit for, but I would think that what you would do is you would establish a model, a mathematical model saying X properties on the Muni database are this much older, we assume this many people are gonna have it variable, spreadsheet style, and then project it out for 3 to 5 years to show, because the math is gonna show that you're gonna come out ahead with much higher property values and much property taxes, and there's this big macro effect. And that's what really you should be, some assumptions, and before you start dicing and slicing with all these amendments and stuff, like, what kind of dollars are you talking about here? That's what I would think.
Us put together 5 to 10 sample properties that follows that criteria, just to illustrate the impact.
Well, I think you do it at that micro level, but you do it on the macro level, which is the every parcel in the Muni, and yeah.
Take a wagon down
Chris, can you have your CFO weigh in on this?
Well, that's, I'll talk.
So I guess we're done. Any comments real quick?